Hello everyone. We're going to be talking this week about printmaking. Now the notion of printmaking is put forth very well in the first paragraph of the chapter, and the author uses the analogy of going out and walking through the mud in your tennis shoes. I bet all of you have done that, and then you walk in across the linoleum floor and you leave prints on the floor. Now your first print is probably going to be pretty strong, and then the more you walk, the mud kind of wears off your shoes and the less of a print you make. Well, printmaking is essentially the same thing. Consider the raised patterns on the bottom of your shoes. Well, this would be called the matrix. The matrix is the surface that you are carving, so that would be the sneaker. Now, the impression or the print on the floor is called the impression, which is made by the matrix. Now, a single matrix in printmaking can be used to create several impressions, and there's many different ways that artists go about carving into the matrix, or in the case of this illustration, into the bottom of the tennis shoes. Now I'd like to ask you all to take a look at the very first page of the chapter. On the left side of the page there's some illustrations that go through relief, intaglio, lithography, screen printing, and digital inkjet. So these are the main areas of printmaking that we're going to be talking about today, and we'll also look at some of the subtexts, some different ways of making prints within each of these categories. So what we're looking at here is a very large woodblock print created by this artist, and in this case he's actually carving away the wood and then printing what is left. Here he is making another print in this woodblock process. Before we start talking about the different kinds of prints, including this one here, which is the oldest woodblock print to have survived, let's look at what we mean by a print. Now, a lot of you go out and buy an art print. In general, most of the prints that we see today are more large-scale commercial reproductions. And for our discussion, we're going to make a real distinction between that. We have what we call art prints, and then we have mass-produced reproductions. And there's some really important differences. In an art print, an artist is going to oversee the process and examine each impression for the quality, and they're going to actually sign each impression. So this would be a limited edition signed artist print, and it can actually be quite valuable. Rejected impressions that the artist does not sign must be destroyed. Now, there's a limited number, so you might get a limited edition print and it would say 43/100. That means it's number 43 out of 100 prints. So the artist will generally not print any more after that, and traditionally the matrix itself would be destroyed. On the other hand, with our technology today, artists can reproduce thousands of prints and use that for their commercial success. So this is an important difference. Everything we're going to be discussing today, until we get to the inkjet printing, is going to be about artist reproductions. So these are limited edition prints. Now let's start with basically the idea of relief, and that means that the image to be printed is raised from a background. You could think of a rubber stamp. A typical rubber stamp is done as a relief print, and woodcuts are the earliest form of these prints. The earliest surviving one is what we're looking at here, and it's from the year 868. It's the only remaining copy from a large edition. Actually, there's a note in with this edition that says that it was reproduced. It's actually something from the Diamond Sutra, which is one of the Buddhist texts, and this was reproduced to introduce the text to a large number of people who would be able to look at it. What we're looking at here is a detail from the same image that's in your book on page 177. So next let's look at some other woodblock prints, and I wanted to bring this one in because it's actually a friend of mine named the artist William McNamara, and he's a fairly well-known regional artist. But what I know is I actually have seen this block print and have worked with shows where we used the original matrix to show his process. Now this particular artist really thrives on detail, and if you look closely you can see that this is actually three different impressions. First we have there's kind of a blue snow color, and then there's the white snow color, and then there's the dark of all the limbs that he printed. So this particular print, which seems to be from just maybe one block, is from three matrices, each intricately carved, that the artist lined up one on top of another to get multiple colors with his woodblock print. Now this is actually a very tricky way of using woodblock, but my friend, the artist Bill McNamara, really I think likes that kind of challenge, and he's done a whole series representing each season of the year. I wanted to present it here because when you see the amount of detail in the actual matrix, when you see how the artist has really carved so carefully each limb of the trees, it's rather striking, and it was a dramatic thing to present along with the showing of his work that I did oversee a few years back. So let's look at one more of these block prints. Now this one is actually a woodcut by the artist Kathy Kolowitz. Now she's a very interesting artist. I'd like you to read the bit about her on page 179. What you need to know about her is that all her art is really sad, and that's because this woman lived, well, she was in the early part of the 20th century in Germany, and as a result of time and consequence and just her life, she lost so many of her male family members to war. She lost, her husband, her father, her son, her nephew, her grandson. They were killed in war. So her art really reflects this great sadness at so much loss in her life. And that's really what she dedicated her artwork to. And even though Kathy Kolowitz had so many other media at her disposal, she really chose to use this very simple form of the woodcut because of its emotional aspect. How she could, there's a kind of a simplicity to this form that really helped her expression of this sadness, which really she did over and over again in her art. So next I'd like to talk about wood engraving, which is a really fascinating style of printmaking, and this is by the artist William Glecker. And the thing, what makes wood engraving different than wood etching or wood carving, wood block prints, is that they use the end of the board. So imagine a 2x4, and you're looking at the end of the 2x4 where all the grain is coming towards you. And rather than working along the grain as we do in the block prints, in this case the end of the board, the grain end, is sanded to a very fine surface, and this allows the artist to carve in all different directions so they can get a very intricate print, but they're using the actual, not along the grain of the wood, but a cross section of the grain, so they can work, again, they sand it finely and then they carve this part of the wood. That's a wood engraving. It's another form of relief. Now let's take a look at lino cuts. This is probably the kind of carving of printmaking that many of you have done. I know that I did linoleum block prints in art class in junior high school and in high school. And the linoleum print is very much like a woodblock print, except for that you're carving into linoleum, which is softer. And you use just an X-Acto knife or a carving tool, usually a kind of a V carving tool, a burin, to carve into the linoleum print. To carve into the linoleum block and then to make a print. This is a very simple printmaking process, and it's harder to get the fine lines, but you can get a great graphic statement, as we see here in this wonderful image. And here we have linoleum block printing, probably done in a classroom setting, which again is something that many of you may have done in school and is a wonderful way to get introduced to printmaking. So the next broad printmaking topic that we're going to talk about is called intaglio. And intaglio is kind of the opposite of the relief process. So in relief, you have your surface and you carve out what's not going to be printed, and what's left on the surface gets printed. very straightforward. You could think of the linoleum block print as an example of relief. Well, here in intaglio we have the opposite. The areas that are going to be printed are below the surface. The ink sinks into the plate, so it's usually done on a metal plate. The ink sinks into the plate, and then the surface of the plate is wiped clean. So dampened paper is put in contact with the plate under pressure, and the paper is pushed into the depressions in the plate to receive the image. The oldest intaglio technique is called engraving, and this started from incising into armor. So people would make these incising, or they would kind of cut into, make a line in the armor using a sharp tool, and somehow this led to this engraving technique. So the burin is the tool that's used to engrave these designs into metal plates. It looks very much like a pen and ink drawing when it's printed. But this was the principal way of reproducing art until lithography was invented along with photography in the 19th century. We're looking now at art by the artist, a print by the artist Albrecht Dürer, and he's considered one of the greatest printmakers of all time. In fact, what he did, he was a very smart man. He was a great painter and a great artist in his great at drawing also. But he figured out that if he could do the printmaking, then he could sell his art to the middle classes. Up until Albrecht Dürer was active in the Renaissance, really art was just there for the wealthiest patrons who could buy originals. Now Dürer, he became very wealthy by making his art available to the masses. He's also considered a master printmaker. If you look on page 183 in your book, there's a very famous print by Dürer, but I chose this one also by Albrecht Dürer because I think it's just amazing. I mean, this is a rhinoceros done in the 1500s. So maybe it's not an exact reproduction, but check out all the textures. Doesn't it look like the artist had a lot of fun by engraving into this metal plate? So again, the surface of the plate is what we see as the white areas, and all of the darker areas are where he has incised into the plate with his tool, and then wiped the plate clean and then printed. So it's really a fascinating process. So next up, under the broad heading of intaglio, we're going to have what they call dry point. And dry point is similar to the engraving process we were just discussing, except that the artist uses a copper plate, and copper is softer. And the plate is incised or carved into with what we call a dry point needle. And this raises a burr, raises a little bit of kind of a rough edge after the artist has incised into it. This edge can be filed down or removed, or it can be left in place to create sort of a fuzzy image. And I will say this duck is done by an unknown artist via the internet, but it's a great example of dry point. Next up, we have mezzotint. And a mezzotint is very similar to the other process, except for in this case the whole plate is roughened so that it creates a black surface when inked, and then the artist smooths away what will not print. So in this example by Nicholas Verkolji, you can see that it's a tendency in the mezzotint process for the whole print to be very dark, and just what comes out at the viewer is what the artist has chosen to carve away. So now let's talk for a moment about etching. Now etching is interesting in that it uses acid to make the print. So first the plate, which is the matrix, a metal plate, is coated with an acid-resistant ground. Now this could be beeswax or asphalt or some other material that's going to resist the acid that the artist will be using. So once the plate is coated with this ground, let's visualize beeswax because that's easy. So you have a metal plate coated with wax. Then the artist draws on the plate with what they call an etching needle to remove the ground in some areas. And then the plate is dipped in acid, which will eat away where the beeswax is not, and then the artist makes a print. Now this particular example might surprise you if I say it's by Rembrandt. Rembrandt is a very famous artist in his etchings. But usually this is not a typical Rembrandt theme,